Hello everyone, this is James O'Keefe from Project Veritas. We're working towards putting the finishing touches on our next investigation, which we'll hopefully be releasing in the near future. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit about something that's happened in recent weeks. Last week was a very tough week for mainstream journalists. I was reading this column by Glenn Greenwald. The U.S. media suffered its most humiliating debacle in ages and now refuses all transparency over what happened. And I think we need to revisit some of the norms that exist in American journalism today, where journalists often selectively quote people under the fig leaf of an agenda instead of illumination to try to justify a headline or hypotheses. And there may be nothing actually wrong with them doing this, but maybe we need to revisit that norm and take a look at it, because we don't often have access to the sources. CNN got in a lot of trouble last week, and they refused to acknowledge who those sources were. Washington Post revealed their sources when they outed that undercover journalist. So in light of this, I wanted to take you to an interview that I did with this Associated Press reporter. This interview was 20 minutes long, and she only quoted me once. And I want to show you the things that she said about the interview versus what actually transpired. So I'm going to take you to Dallas, Texas with this sort of deconstructing the Associated Press. So let's go to the first clip. If we're doing something on the Washington Post, it's going to be in the context of getting them on tape to tell the truth and to admit either their biases or how the paper works or how honest they are and so forth and so on. So in a 20-minute interview, that was the only time that Ms. Schmall from the Associated Press actually quoted me. That was the only time. Then Ms. Schmall goes on to talk about other things. Now let's take a look at what she did not include and what she did not quote me saying. Ms. Schmall asks me about Donors Trust, a donor advised fund, a trust account that are common in many charities and organizations that take donations. And here was her question.
As you well know, nonprofits, charities in this country are notoriously murky, for lack of a better word. I mean, at least the New York Times, publicly traded, you can look up on Edgar all of its financial statements. You can see who the major shareholders are. You can't do that with your group.
So here, Ms. Schmall asked me a question. I have a very long answer, and she doesn't include anything from her article. Her article simply states, quote, Project Veritas has received more than $4 million from Donors Trust, a dark money charity that supports individual as opposed to government solutions to societal problems, tax records showed. My answer? Nowhere in the piece. Noam Chomsky wrote a book called Manufacturing Consent, and he talked about these publicly traded corporations. Brown and Williamson, the case in CBS News in the 1990s, they literally spiked a story on big tobacco because of a CBS News Westinghouse merger. You want to talk about power and abuse of power? I don't have that problem. When the stories came out on the election on Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton I showed you tonight, did you know that Sinclair Media spiked those stories? And I believe it probably was because of a merger with the FCC, or the FCC was taking away their, their license. So if you're going to talk about, I don't know, if you're going to insinuate or ask or inquire about conflicts of interest with me being the chairman of my own nonprofit organization, crowdsourced funded by 20,000 donors, you better ask the New York Times and CBS News and Washington Post and CNN and Time Warner what conflicts they have. So here's a question for Ms. Schmall in the Associated Press. Why not include in the article that I said we have 20,000 donors? If you are going to say that Donors Trust contributed this money and make some type of insinuation. Again, I'm not necessarily saying that she did or she did not take us out of context. What we're doing here is deconstructing the Associated Press and revisiting the norms of journalism. Ms. Schmall of the Associated Press also asks me about my politics, and she writes in this article, quote, though he has said he has no formal training as a journalist, and on Wednesday reiterated that he does not consider himself a conservative, O'Keefe helped found a conservative monthly journal called The Centurion as an undergraduate at Rutgers University, unquote. Let's take a look at what she asked and what I actually said.
Why don't you expose bias among conservative circles?
Because we tend to go after the sacred cows, the organizations that many people in media don't choose for whatever reason to go after. I think what what's in the heart of a lot of the people that work for me is a sense of justice, a sense of counterbalance. And I think that, you know, I mean, just look at the thing I talked about tonight with Acorn and Planned Parenthood. I mean, these are taxpayer-funded institutions that have been around for decades. And maybe the biggest story is, why did it take two kids with a handy cam and their grandmother's chinchilla coat to do it? And if you really want the truth, is I'm not motivated, I mean, you can believe me or not, but I'm really not motivated by politics. I'm motivated by a desire to inform the people about what people really believe. And the great thing about that is that Veritas is this reality. It's just if there's a person sitting over there, you're wearing a hidden camera. I can't put words into the person's mouth. I'm just exposing, we are exposing what happens. You know, I think that's what motivates a lot of people, is that gap between reality and what the newspapers feed them, kind of is evidenced by this situation. I mean, again, this reporter, I don't know if she knows, I think she knows she's being filmed. Our cameraman was clearly visible, he had the camera behind her. But for whatever reason, you can't see what I'm saying here in this Associated Press article. You can't hear me talk about justice in that article. You can't, the word counterbalance wasn't mentioned. The word justice wasn't mentioned, which is really what we're motivated by, is a desire to narrow that gap between reality and the way reality is presented to us. Let's continue. Perhaps the most confounding part of this piece, there's no mention of our Washington Post videos at all. Dan Lamothe did apologize, as you recall. He apologized for his naked honesty in the bar, talking about how he can't believe what some of his editorial comments say. But I said this to the Associated Press reporter, and she chose to not include it in her article. It's just the contradiction between what these good, honest people are saying. They're not villains, by the way. John Bonifield, Dan Lamothe, Entus, they're not villains. They're just honest, unwitting whistleblowers. And what my point is, why doesn't the paper say what he's saying? Why don't they use those quotes in their reporting? Why do we have to expose it? Now listen, no edit in the history of Project Veritas ever rises to the degree of which even this Associated Press reporter edited her piece. And unlike the written word, or the word on paper, Project Veritas uses video, which illuminates. You're able to hear and see the actual words right out of people's mouths, along with their intonation, their body language, and the nonverbal cues that you don't get in the spoken word. Another anecdote today is Ken Vogel of the New York Times did a piece on Project Veritas. I don't think it was terrible, but Ken Vogel did quote two of our donors. He called probably dozens, and he didn't disclose that he called a few dozen donors. He quoted two. One of them said something positive, one of them said something but that donor told me that he was quoted out of context and said he was going to contribute more money to Project Veritas. So I think we need to revisit these norms in American journalism and really have a serious conversation about what type of world we want to live in. And I think that's coming to a head now with what's happened with CNN, and as we continue to record more raw interviews with or without the consent of the journalists that interview people, I think we'll get some more illumination.